January 27, 1945, minus 20 degrees Celsius, and Soviet Lieutenant Anatoly Shapiro stands at the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau, staring at what his mind cannot process. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms stumbling toward him through the snow, 7,000 human beings reduced to walking corpses, and behind them the evidence of industrialized murder on a scale history had never witnessed. Shapiro, a veteran of 3 years of brutal Eastern Front combat who'd seen Stalingrad and Kursk, who thought nothing could shock him anymore, drops to his knees and vomits. This is January 1945. By August, the world will have witnessed the firebombing of Dresden that killed 25,000 in 3 days, the fall of Berlin and Hitler's suicide, the liberation of Bergen-Belsen where British soldiers found 60,000 prisoners and 13,000 unburied corpses, the revelation of the full scope of the Holocaust, and the detonation of 2 atomic bombs over Japanese cities that introduced humanity to the possibility of its own extinction. 1945 wasn't just a year. It was a psychological earthquake that shattered the 20th century's faith in progress, civilization, and human nature itself, leaving trauma that would echo through generations in ways we're still discovering today. The numbers alone are staggering and insufficient to capture the horror. Between January and September 1945, over 8 million people died in combat and from war-related causes, more than any previous 9-month period in human history. The final months of the European War saw death rates that exceeded even the worst periods of 1941-1942, because both sides fought with apocalyptic desperation, Germany knowing defeat was inevitable but fighting anyway, the Soviets seeking vengeance for 4 years of Nazi atrocities, the Western Allies horrified by the concentration camps they were discovering and determined that Germany pay for its crimes. The Pacific War climaxed with the firebombing of Tokyo in March that killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, then the August atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that killed over 200,000 immediately and condemned tens of thousands more to slow deaths from radiation poisoning. But the numbers, horrific as they are, cannot convey the psychological impact. The moment when the world confronted what humans were capable of doing to other humans, when the thin veneer of civilization was stripped away to reveal something monstrous beneath, when soldiers, civilians, and even the victors realized that everyone had been changed by what they'd witnessed and what they'd done, and that there was no going back to the innocence that existed before. The question that haunts this story, that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives, and that continues to haunt their descendants, is this: how do you live after witnessing the end of the world? How do you process experiences that break every category your mind has for making sense of reality? How do you return to normal life, raise children, go to work, pretend everything is fine when you've seen mountains of corpses, when you've participated in or witnessed atrocities, when you know with absolute certainty that humanity is capable of building death factories and reducing cities to radioactive ash? 1945 wasn't just the year that ended World War II. It was the year that ended certain comforting illusions about human nature, about progress, about the idea that civilization made us fundamentally different from our barbaric ancestors, and the trauma of that realization, the psychological wound of having illusions shattered so completely and violently, created patterns of damage that are still being transmitted through families and cultures 80 years later. To understand why 1945 was uniquely traumatic, why it scarred the human psyche in ways that previous wars hadn't, we need to understand the specific combination of factors that made that year different from all previous human violence. First, the scale. World War II was the first truly global conflict where industrialized nations directed their full productive capacity toward destruction, where civilian populations became primary targets rather than collateral damage, where death could be administered not just individually but systematically to entire populations. Second, the revelation. 1945 was when the full scope of Nazi genocide became undeniable, when liberating armies found the camps and the world could no longer pretend it didn't know, when the comfortable distinction between civilized nations and barbaric ones collapsed, because Germany had been considered the pinnacle of Western culture, and it had built Auschwitz. Third, the technology. The atomic bomb represented a threshold moment when humanity acquired the power to destroy itself completely, when war could no longer be understood as political conflict with winners and losers, but as potential species suicide. These three factors, scale, revelation, and technology, converged in 1945 to create a psychological crisis that no previous generation had faced. The cultural and psychological context of the 1930s that led to this crisis involved the collision of 19th century optimism about progress with 20th century capacity for destruction. The generation that fought World War II had been raised on narratives of inevitable improvement, that science would solve problems, that democracy would spread, that war was becoming obsolete as nations grew more economically interdependent. The Great War of 1914-1918 had challenged these assumptions, but intellectuals and political leaders had managed to frame it as an aberration, a final spasm of old imperial conflicts that the League of Nations and international cooperation would prevent from recurring. The 1920s, despite economic troubles, maintained this hopeful narrative. Art flourished, science advanced, international agreements like the Kellogg-Briand Pact tried to outlaw war itself. But beneath this optimism, darker currents were building. The Great Depression that began in 1929 shattered economic stability and created desperation that demagogues exploited. Fascism offered simple explanations for complex problems, blamed internal and external enemies, and promised national restoration through violence. Germany's Nazi Party, which gained power in 1933, represented the most extreme version of this fascist vision, a movement that explicitly rejected Enlightenment values of universal human rights, that glorified war and racial hierarchy, and that saw mass murder not as a regrettable necessity, but as a positive good that would purify the nation. The slide toward war throughout the 1930s represented a progressive abandonment of the optimistic assumptions that had defined the post-World War I period. Each Nazi aggression, rearmament, Rhineland militarization, annexation of Austria, dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, met with Western appeasement based on the hope that Hitler's demands were limited and rational, that avoiding war was worth almost any compromise. This appeasement reflected not cowardice, but psychological inability to accept that a major European nation was led by a movement genuinely committed to genocide and conquest, that the comfortable assumptions about civilized behavior were invalid. When war finally came in September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland, it still seemed possible that this would be a limited conflict that diplomatic settlement could resolve. The transformation from that limited vision to the apocalyptic reality of 1945 represents one of the most rapid and complete psychological transitions in human history. From believing war was becoming obsolete to recognizing that industrial civilization made more destructive war possible than previous generations could have imagined, from assuming certain moral lines would never be crossed to discovering that those lines were illusions. The progressive revelation of atrocities throughout the war created a psychological trajectory that climaxed in 1945 when the full scope could no longer be denied. Early reports of Nazi mass murders, the Einsatzgruppen shootings on the Eastern Front, the initial deportations to camps, were treated with skepticism by Allied governments and publics who remembered the exaggerated atrocity propaganda from World War I and assumed similar exaggeration now. Even Jewish organizations pleading for rescue operations faced the response that reports must be inflated, that such systematic murder was impossible in the 20th century. This denial wasn't primarily anti-Semitism, though that played a role. It was psychological defense against information that threatened basic assumptions about civilization. If reports were true, if a modern European nation was systematically murdering millions of civilians for no military purpose but pure ideology, then everything comfortable about Western civilization was a lie. Better to assume the reports were exaggerated than to confront that unbearable truth. But 1945 made denial impossible. When British and American forces liberated camps in Western Germany, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, they brought photographers and journalists who documented everything. When Soviet forces liberated camps in Poland, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, the evidence was overwhelming. The world was forced to look at photographs and newsreels showing mountains of corpses, gas chambers, crematoria, survivors who looked like skeletons. The psychological impact was devastating because it shattered the comfortable narratives that had made the war psychologically bearable. For Allied soldiers who liberated the camps, the psychological trauma was immediate and profound in ways that combat stress wasn't. Combat trauma, now recognized as PTSD, occurs when soldiers face life-threatening situations that trigger overwhelming fear responses. But that's comprehensible fear. evolutionary fear that makes biological sense. The trauma of camp liberation was different. It was moral injury, the shattering of fundamental assumptions about human nature and meaning. British soldier Peter Coombs, who entered Bergen-Belsen, later described being unable to eat for days because the smell of cooking meat reminded him of burning bodies, unable to sleep, because closing his eyes brought images of corpses stacked like cordwood, unable to explain to family back home what he'd seen because the words didn't exist to convey it. American Lieutenant William Cowling, liberating a subcamp of Buchenwald, wrote in his journal, "I cannot reconcile what I've seen with what I was taught about human nature, about civilization, about God. If this is possible, then everything I believed is a lie, and I don't know how to live with that." This moral injury affected liberators differently than combat affected frontline soldiers. Combat veterans could process their experiences within frameworks of duty, courage, survival, but camp liberators couldn't find frameworks that made sense of industrialized murder. The result was psychological damage that often went undiagnosed because it didn't fit existing categories of combat stress. Damage that manifested in depression, alcoholism, relationship failures, and in many cases, suicide years or decades after the war ended. For Holocaust survivors, 1945 represented liberation but not healing. It was the beginning of confronting what had been endured, what had been lost, and what survival meant. Viktor Frankl, psychiatrist and Auschwitz survivor, described liberation as psychologically complex. The joy of freedom mixed with devastation of learning which family members had been murdered, the realization that home and community no longer existed, the struggle to find meaning in survival when so many others had died. Frankl developed logotherapy partly to address this survivor guilt. The question of why you survived when others didn't, whether survival meant something or was just chance, whether you had a moral obligation to live in particular ways because you were spared. Many survivors experienced what researchers now call complex PTSD combined with profound moral injury, not just the trauma of what they'd endured, but the shattering of any worldview that could make sense of it. How do you believe in human goodness after Auschwitz? How do you trust institutions after they either actively participated in genocide or passively allowed it? How do you raise children in a world where you know with certainty that neighbors can become murderers, that law can become an instrument of evil, that civilization is a mask that can be torn off to reveal something monstrous? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were immediate psychological challenges that survivors faced every day as they tried to rebuild lives from nothing. The challenges of 1945 extended beyond liberation of camps to include the final months of combat in Europe and Asia, which were among the most brutal of the entire war, precisely because all sides knew the end was approaching and fought with desperate nihilism. The Battle of Berlin in April-May 1945 saw Soviet forces assault a city defended by a mix of fanatical SS troops, regular Wehrmacht soldiers, Volkssturm militia composed of old men and boys, and Hitler Youth members as young as 12 fighting with handheld anti-tank weapons. The combat was house to house, room to room, with casualties measured in hundreds of thousands. Soviet soldiers, many of whom had lost family members to Nazi aggression, committed mass rapes and atrocities against German civilians, crimes that were simultaneously war crimes and comprehensible human responses to 4 years of suffering German invasion. German civilians, who'd spent years supporting or tolerating the Nazi regime, now faced consequences they hadn't imagined when victory seemed certain. The psychological complexity of this final European combat was that there were no clean moral categories. Soviet soldiers were simultaneously liberators and perpetrators. German civilians were simultaneously victims and complicit supporters of genocide, and everyone was traumatized in ways that would take generations to process. The final months of the Pacific War introduced a different dimension of trauma through strategic bombing campaigns that deliberately targeted civilian populations to break Japanese will to resist. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th at 10, 1945, killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night, creating a firestorm that melted the asphalt and boiled the water in canals where people sought refuge. Curtis LeMay, the American general who designed the raid, later acknowledged, "If we'd lost the war, we'd all have been prosecuted as war criminals." This recognition that the line between legitimate strategic bombing and war crimes was thin or non-existent created moral injury in some bomber crews who understood they were killing civilians en masse. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th represented an escalation in scale and type, not just more destruction, but a fundamental threshold where a single bomber carrying a single weapon could destroy an entire city, where radiation created suffering that extended long after the explosion, and where humanity demonstrated the capacity for its own extinction. The crews of the Enola Gay and Boxcar experienced this moral complexity acutely. They'd performed military duties that their commanders and political leaders deemed necessary to end the war and save lives that invasion would cost. But they'd also killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in seconds, many of whom suffered horrible deaths from radiation, and they'd introduced humanity to a form of war that made all previous war seem quaint. The climax of 1945's psychological impact came in the months between May and September, when victory brought not relief, but the full confrontation with what the war had been and what it had made of those who fought it. Germany surrendered on May 8th, but the surrender didn't bring closure. It brought the Nuremberg trials, where the full documentary evidence of Nazi crimes was presented. It brought displaced persons camps, filled with millions who had no homes to return to. And it brought the partition of Europe that would shape the next 45 years of Cold War tension. For German civilians, May 1945 began what they called Stunde Null, 0 hour, the moment when everything had to be rebuilt from nothing. But it also brought what Germans couldn't initially confront: collective guilt for having supported or tolerated a regime that committed genocide. This guilt was so overwhelming that initial German response was often denial, claims that they hadn't known about the camps, that they'd been deceived by propaganda, that ordinary Germans were victims too. This denial was psychologically protective, but morally inadequate, and the tension between needing to deny to maintain sanity and needing to acknowledge to maintain humanity created psychological damage that Germans would pass to their children and grandchildren. For Allied soldiers, victory brought the challenge of returning to civilian life after experiences that had fundamentally changed them. The GI Bill helped practically by providing education and housing benefits, but it couldn't address the psychological chasm between what they'd seen and what civilians could understand. Many veterans found they couldn't talk about the war with family members who asked cheerful questions about their service, who wanted heroes and adventure stories, who couldn't grasp what it meant to have killed people, to have seen friends die, to have participated in or witnessed atrocities. The psychological literature from the period shows that combat exhaustion or battle fatigue, what we now call PTSD, was widespread but poorly understood. Treatment often consisted of telling soldiers to be tough, to move on, to focus on the future. This suppression of trauma rather than processing it created time bombs that exploded years or decades later in depression, alcoholism, violence, and suicide. For their children, the war children generation, growing up with fathers who were emotionally unavailable, prone to rage, prone to drinking too much, created attachment disorders and trauma that researchers now recognize as intergenerational transmission. The atomic bombings created a distinct form of trauma that persists today: nuclear anxiety, the permanent knowledge that human extinction is possible, that we live under the shadow of weapons that could end civilization. Before August 1945, war was horrible but survivable. You could lose a war and rebuild. After August 1945, war between nuclear powers meant potential annihilation, a prospect so overwhelming that the human psyche struggles to process it. The Hibakusha, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, faced unique suffering: physical injuries from radiation that caused cancers and genetic damage, social stigma from other Japanese who feared radiation contamination and treated survivors as damaged, and moral injury from being forced to represent nuclear war's consequences, while their government initially denied or minimized the bomb's effects. For the broader world, the atomic bombings created what psychologists call nuclear neurosis, a low-grade anxiety about potential apocalypse that became ambient feature of modern consciousness. Children during the Cold War grew up with duck-and-cover drills, teaching them to hide under desks if nuclear war came, a simultaneously reassuring and terrifying message that authority was preparing them to survive something unsurvivable. The resolution and legacy of 1945's trauma extends across generations in ways that research is still uncovering. The immediate post-war years saw a deliberate effort by governments and societies to move on, to rebuild, to not dwell on what had happened, because dwelling seemed too painful and too dangerous for social stability. This suppression created what some historians call a conspiracy of silence, where survivors, veterans, and witnesses kept their trauma private because discussing it risked being seen as weak, unpatriotic, or unable to cope. But trauma suppressed doesn't disappear, it transmits. Children of Holocaust survivors showed higher rates of anxiety, depression, and PTSD, despite never experiencing the Holocaust themselves. Children of combat veterans showed higher rates of violence, substance abuse, and difficulty with emotional regulation. Children of German perpetrators showed unique patterns of inherited shame, identity confusion, and difficulty trusting their own moral judgment. These patterns persisted into grandchildren and great-grandchildren, creating what researchers call intergenerational or transgenerational trauma, the transmission of psychological wounds across generations through parenting patterns, family narratives, and possibly epigenetic changes that affect stress response genes. The cultural legacy of 1945 shaped everything that came after. The United Nations, founded on the promise, "Never again," the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, asserting that some values transcend national sovereignty. The Geneva Conventions, updated to address civilian protection, the concept of crimes against humanity that individuals could be prosecuted for regardless of whether they were following orders. But these legal and institutional responses, important as they were, couldn't fully address the psychological wound that 1945 had inflicted. The knowledge that civilization is fragile, that progress isn't inevitable, that humans are capable of building death camps and nuclear weapons, and that the next catastrophe is always possible. This knowledge changed art, literature, philosophy, and theology. How do you maintain religious faith after Auschwitz? How do you write novels when language seems inadequate to what happened? How do you photograph beauty when you've photographed corpses? These weren't abstract questions for intellectuals. They were immediate challenges for millions of people trying to make meaning after meaning had been shattered. The psychological research on trauma evolved dramatically because of 1945 and its aftermath. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy emphasized finding meaning even in suffering. Bruno Bettelheim's work with child survivors explored how trauma disrupts development. Later researchers like Judith Herman and Bessel van der Kolk expanded understanding of how trauma affects the body and the brain, how it creates physical as well as psychological symptoms, and how healing requires addressing both. The recognition that trauma can be transmitted across generations came partly from studying children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and has profound implications for understanding how historical events shape populations long after they've ended. Contemporary conflicts, Rwanda, Bosnia, Syria, Myanmar, show that the lessons of 1945 weren't fully learned, that genocide remains possible, that the international community struggles to intervene effectively. But research on intergenerational trauma offers some hope. Breaking the transmission is possible through therapeutic intervention, through truth-telling rather than silence, through creating spaces where survivors and descendants can process what was inherited without guilt or shame. So what do we take from 1945, the year that shattered the 20th century and left psychological wounds we're still treating 80 years later? First, that trauma doesn't end when the traumatic event ends, that liberation isn't healing, that victory doesn't mean recovery, and that the work of processing what happened is measured in generations, not years. Second, that silence about trauma doesn't protect the next generation. It burdens them with inherited pain they can't name or understand, while truth-telling, however painful, allows conscious processing rather than unconscious transmission. Third, that the psychological costs of war extend far beyond physical casualties, that moral injury from witnessing or committing atrocities can be as devastating as physical wounds, and that societies that send people to war have obligations to help them reintegrate. Fourth, that technology changes the stakes. Nuclear weapons mean that future wars could be existentially final in ways previous wars weren't, and this knowledge creates psychological burdens that previous generations didn't carry. Fifth, that meaning-making matters, that humans need frameworks to make sense of suffering, and that when frameworks collapse, when you can't reconcile Auschwitz with faith in God or humanity, the psychological damage is profound and requires new frameworks that can hold that complexity. The ultimate question 1945 poses is, can we learn from trauma without being destroyed by it? Can we remember what humans are capable of, both the genocide and the resistance to genocide, both the atomic bomb and the choice of some not to use it when they could have, without becoming paralyzed by despair or cynical about human nature? The answer seems to be that we must hold both truths, that humans built Auschwitz and that humans liberated it, that we created nuclear weapons and that we've so far chosen not to use them again. That civilization is fragile but real. That progress is possible but never inevitable. This complexity is uncomfortable because it offers no simple lessons, no reassuring narratives about inherent goodness or evil. But perhaps that discomfort is itself the lesson. That moral seriousness requires refusing easy answers, requires sitting with ambiguity, requires recognizing that we carry forward both the potential for atrocity and the potential for extraordinary courage and compassion, and that which potential we actualize depends on choices we make individually and collectively every day. As we close this examination of 1945, consider what your own family experienced that year. Were they liberators or survivors, perpetrators or bystanders, soldiers or civilians? What stories were told and what stories were silenced? What trauma might you have inherited without knowing its source? Drop a comment sharing any family connections to 1945, any stories that were passed down or kept secret, any ways you see that year's legacy in your own life. If this history resonates with you, if it helps make sense of patterns you've noticed in your family or culture, hit that like button to help others discover that history isn't safely in the past, but lives in our present through the psychological wounds we inherit. Subscribe for more deep dives into how World War II shaped modern psychology, how trauma transmits across generations, and how understanding history helps us understand ourselves. Click the notification bell for our next video, examining how different nations processed 1945 differently, why Germany developed a culture of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or working through the past, while Japan struggled more with acknowledging atrocities, and what those different approaches mean for healing. Until then, remember that 1945 isn't history in the sense of being over and done. It's living history that shaped our parents and grandparents, that informed how they raised us, and that continues to influence how we think about violence, trauma, and what humans are capable of doing to each other. That knowledge is both burden and gift. Burden because it removes comforting illusions about progress and civilization. Gift because it arms us with truth about what must be resisted and what must be remembered, so that the worst of 1945 never happens again, while the courage and resilience shown by survivors and resistors continues to inspire. The specific mechanisms through which 1945's trauma embedded itself into human consciousness and transmitted across generations deserve deeper examination, because understanding these processes illuminates not just historical suffering, but contemporary challenges with inherited pain, collective memory, and the long shadows that catastrophic violence casts across time. The year didn't create a single unified trauma, but rather a constellation of distinct yet interconnected psychological wounds, each with its own character and transmission pattern. For concentration camp survivors, the trauma was rooted in prolonged exposure to dehumanization, starvation, disease, witnessing mass murder, and the constant proximity to death that lasted months or years. For combat soldiers who liberated the camps, the trauma was acute moral injury from discovering evidence of atrocities beyond imagination, forcing recognition that their enemy had been even worse than propaganda claimed, and that their own side's violence, however brutal, was justified response to something monstrous. For Hibakusha in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the trauma combined physical suffering from radiation effects with existential terror of a new form of warfare that could erase cities in instants, and with social stigma from other Japanese who feared contamination. For German civilians, particularly women who suffered mass rape during Soviet occupation, the trauma involved being victimized by forces whose violence was comprehensible revenge for Nazi crimes, creating impossible psychological tangles where they were simultaneously victims deserving compassion and members of a nation that deserved punishment. The immediate aftermath of liberation created psychological challenges that survivors describe as in some ways more difficult than the camps themselves, because liberation removed the singular focus on survival and forced confrontation with devastating losses and impossible questions about meaning. Primo Levi, Italian chemist and Auschwitz survivor, wrote extensively about this liberation crisis when the joy of freedom collided with the reality of what freedom meant. His family was dead. His community was destroyed. His home in Turin was occupied by strangers. The Italy he returned to was impoverished and chaotic, and many Italians didn't want to hear about the camps, either because they didn't believe the accounts or because their own wartime suffering, Allied bombing, German occupation, civil war between fascists and partisans, made them resentful of anyone claiming special victim status. Levy described feeling guilty for surviving when better people had died, feeling angry at the world's indifference, feeling unable to communicate what he'd experienced because language seemed inadequate. His response was to write, to bear witness, to create testimony that might help others understand. But even that response carried psychological costs because revisiting trauma to write about it meant never fully leaving it behind. Many survivors couldn't write or speak about their experiences for decades, maintaining silence that protected them from re-traumatization, but that also isolated them and prevented processing. The psychological research on Holocaust trauma began almost immediately in 1945 and has continued for 8 decades, making it the most extensively studied example of how extreme trauma affects individuals and transmits through generations. Early research by psychiatrists working with survivors in displaced persons camps documented what they termed concentration camp syndrome, a cluster of symptoms including nightmares, flashbacks, survivor guilt, inability to feel pleasure, difficulty trusting others, hypervigilance, and somatic complaints like chronic pain and digestive problems that had no clear physical cause. These symptoms matched what we now call complex PTSD, but in 1945, there was no diagnostic category or treatment protocol, and many survivors were simply told to try to forget, to move forward, to build new lives. This advice, while well-intentioned, was psychologically harmful because trauma doesn't disappear through willful forgetting. It goes underground, affecting behavior, relationships, and physical health in ways the person may not consciously connect to their traumatic past. Survivors who tried to forget often found themselves unable to form intimate relationships because intimacy required vulnerability and trust that trauma had destroyed, unable to parent effectively because their own childhoods had been stolen and they had no models for healthy development, and unable to feel safe in the world because they knew with absolute certainty that safety was illusion and that catastrophe could arrive without warning. The transmission of Holocaust trauma to the second generation, children of survivors born after the war, became apparent in the 1960s when Canadian psychiatrist Vivian Rakoff published the first clinical observations of what researchers would later call second-generation syndrome. Rakoff noticed that children of Holocaust survivors were seeking psychiatric treatment at rates significantly higher than the general population, despite never experiencing the Holocaust themselves, and their symptoms, anxiety disorders, depression, identity confusion, difficulties with separation from parents, seemed connected to their parents' unprocessed trauma. Subsequent research confirmed these patterns and identified transmission mechanisms. Parents who couldn't discuss their experiences created atmospheres of unnamed dread that children absorbed without understanding. Parents who were overprotective because they'd lost everyone prevented children from developing autonomy and confidence. Parents who were emotionally numb from trauma couldn't provide the warmth and attunement children need for secure attachment, and parents who idealized the dead created impossible standards that living children could never meet. The psychological literature documents cases of children who had nightmares about concentration camps they'd never seen, who feared showers because parents had told them about gas chambers disguised as showers, who developed eating disorders because food scarcity had traumatized parents, and who struggled with survivor guilt inherited from parents, even though the children themselves had nothing to feel guilty about. The intergenerational transmission extended to third and even fourth generations, demonstrating that trauma's effects don't dilute over time, but rather transform, taking different shapes in each generation while maintaining connection to the original wound. Grandchildren of Holocaust survivors report feeling burdened by family silence about the past, feeling pressure to succeed to compensate for murdered relatives they never knew, feeling anxious in ways they can't explain until they learn their family history and realize their anxiety makes sense as inherited response to ancestral trauma. The epigenetic research conducted by Rachel Yehuda and colleagues found that Holocaust survivors and their descendants show altered stress hormone patterns and changes in genes regulating stress response, suggesting that trauma can literally alter biology in ways that transmit across generations. This research is controversial, and the mechanisms aren't fully understood, but the clinical observations are clear. Trauma affects not just those who experienced it directly, but their descendants, and healing requires acknowledging this intergenerational impact rather than assuming that time or distance from the original trauma automatically brings recovery. The trauma experienced by combat soldiers in 1945's final campaigns had different character than concentration camp trauma, but was equally severe and equally inadequately treated. The final months of fighting in Europe and the Pacific saw some of the war's highest psychiatric casualty rates because soldiers were exhausted after years of combat, because the fighting was particularly intense and chaotic, and because everyone knew the war was ending, which created psychological pressure to survive just a little longer. American psychiatrist William Menninger, who served as chief psychiatrist for the Army, documented that psychiatric casualties, soldiers who broke down mentally and couldn't continue fighting, sometimes exceeded physical casualties in certain units. The symptoms were varied. Some soldiers became catatonic, unable to move or speak. Others developed uncontrollable shaking or crying. Others became violent and dangerous to their own units. Still others simply walked away from combat positions in what looked like desertion, but was actually dissociative fugue state where they weren't consciously aware of their actions. Military psychiatry in 1945 had limited tools. Brief rest periods near the front lines, reassurance that they weren't cowards, and in severe cases, sedation or electroshock therapy that often did more harm than good. The challenge for military psychiatry was balancing humanitarian care for traumatized soldiers with military necessity of maintaining combat effectiveness, and that tension created treatment approaches that prioritized returning soldiers to combat over genuine healing. The doctrine of forward psychiatry held that psychiatric casualties should be treated as close to the front lines as possible to prevent them from identifying as disabled and to maintain their connection to their units. This approach had some effectiveness in reducing chronic disability, but it also meant that soldiers were often returned to combat before they genuinely recovered, setting up cycles of breakdown and return that caused cumulative damage. The soldiers who broke down repeatedly often developed deep shame, seeing themselves as weak or cowardly, when in reality they'd endured stresses that would overwhelm any human nervous system. This shame prevented many from seeking help after the war, because admitting to psychiatric problems meant admitting to perceived weakness, and the culture of masculine stoicism that dominated 1940s America made emotional vulnerability almost impossible for men to acknowledge. The return home for combat veterans created psychological challenges that the society celebrating victory was unprepared to address. The GI Bill provided education benefits that helped millions of veterans build middle-class lives, but it couldn't address the psychological chasm between their wartime experiences and civilian expectations. Veterans describe feeling alienated from civilians who couldn't understand what they'd been through, feeling angry at people who complained about trivial problems when veterans had seen real suffering, feeling unable to experience pleasure or meaning in civilian activities that seemed pointless after the intensity of combat. Many veterans coped through avoidance, throwing themselves into work, refusing to discuss the war, maintaining emotional distance from family members to avoid vulnerability that might trigger breakdown. These avoidance strategies allowed functioning but prevented genuine connection, and children of these veterans often describe fathers who were physically present but emotionally absent, who could be kind but couldn't be warm, who provided materially but couldn't provide the emotional attunement children need. The psychological literature on children of combat veterans shows elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and relationship difficulties, demonstrating that the father's unprocessed trauma affected the next generation even when never explicitly discussed. The atomic bombings created a distinct trauma that extended beyond the immediate victims to affect global consciousness in ways that persist today. The Hibakusha, survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, faced the unique challenge of physical injuries from radiation that caused cancers and other diseases years or decades after exposure, creating medical uncertainty where they never knew if current health problems were radiation effects or normal aging. This medical uncertainty was compounded by social stigma. Other Japanese feared that radiation was contagious or that hibakusha were genetically damaged, leading to discrimination in marriage and employment. Many hibakusha hid their status to avoid stigma, but this secrecy prevented them from seeking medical care they needed and from processing their trauma through speaking about it. The Japanese government initially provided minimal support to hibakusha, partly because acknowledging the bomb's effects would have required acknowledging Japan's defeat more completely than the government wanted, and partly because the American occupation authorities suppressed information about radiation effects to avoid criticism of the decision to use atomic weapons. The global psychological impact of the atomic bombs extended far beyond Japan to create what researchers call nuclear anxiety or atomic neurosis, a low-grade fear of nuclear annihilation that became an ambient feature of modern consciousness. In the immediate aftermath, many scientists and intellectuals expressed horror at what had been created and what it meant for humanity's future. Robert Oppenheimer, scientific director of the Manhattan Project, famously quoted the Bhagavad Gita after the first atomic test, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he advocated for international control of nuclear weapons and later opposed development of the hydrogen bomb, positions that led to his security clearance being revoked and his effective exile from weapons development. Other Manhattan Project scientists formed organizations advocating for nuclear disarmament, struggling with guilt about their role in creating weapons of mass destruction even as they believed they'd been necessary to end the war. This moral complexity, that the bombs were simultaneously justified by the context of total war and horrifying in their effects, created psychological burdens that scientists carried for life. For the broader public, particularly after the Soviet Union developed atomic weapons in 1949 and the nuclear arms race began, the knowledge that nuclear war could destroy civilization created new forms of anxiety that affected children particularly acutely. Civil defense programs in the 1950s taught schoolchildren to duck and cover, to hide under desks if they saw a nuclear flash, creating the simultaneously reassuring and terrifying message that nuclear war was survivable if you took simple precautions. The psychological impact of growing up with this ambient nuclear threat has been documented extensively. Children had nightmares about nuclear war, developed anxieties about world-ending catastrophe, and sometimes struggled with sense of nihilism. Why plan for the future if the world might end tomorrow? This nuclear anxiety affected different people differently. Some became activists working for disarmament. Some developed fatalistic attitudes that justified living only for present pleasure. Some suppressed the anxiety and pretended normalcy. And some experienced the anxiety as contributing factor to depression and other mental health problems. The anxiety never fully went away even after the Cold War ended, because nuclear weapons still exist, and the possibility of nuclear war, however remote, remains real. The trauma of German civilians in 1945 created psychological challenges that Germany as a society struggled to address for decades, because acknowledging German suffering seemed to minimize German guilt for Nazi crimes. The final months of the war brought catastrophe to German cities through Allied strategic bombing that deliberately targeted civilian populations to break German will to resist and to render cities uninhabitable. The firebombing of Dresden on February 13, 1945, killed approximately 25,000 people in 2 days, creating a firestorm similar to Hamburg's, but with the added element that Dresden had been considered a cultural treasure and refugee haven, making its destruction particularly shocking. Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin, and dozens of other German cities experienced similar destruction, leaving millions homeless, traumatized by bombing raids, and facing starvation as food distribution systems collapsed. The Soviet offensive into Eastern Germany brought different trauma. Mass rapes of German women, estimated between several 100,000 to 2 million, committed by Soviet soldiers seeking revenge for German atrocities in the Soviet Union. The flight of millions of ethnic Germans from Eastern territories created humanitarian catastrophe, where thousands died from exposure, starvation, or violence during the exodus. The psychological challenge for Germans was that their suffering was both real and their own fault. They'd supported or tolerated the Nazi regime that started the war and committed genocide, and the Allied bombing and Soviet violence were comprehensible responses to Nazi aggression. This complex moral situation created psychological patterns that researchers call secondary traumatization, combined with collective guilt. Germans were traumatized by what they'd endured, but felt they couldn't claim victim status because their nation had perpetrated worse, creating a psychological bind where they had to suppress their own trauma to maintain moral clarity about Nazi crimes. The immediate post-war response was often denial. Many Germans claimed they hadn't known about the Holocaust, that they'd been deceived by propaganda, that they too were victims of Hitler. This denial allowed psychological functioning, but prevented genuine reckoning, and it created intergenerational patterns where parents couldn't discuss the war honestly with children, where family secrets about Nazi participation festered, and where unprocessed guilt transmitted to children and grandchildren who inherited shame without understanding its source. The cultural response to 1945's trauma varied dramatically across nations in ways that reflected different relationships to the war and different cultural frameworks for processing collective suffering. Britain emerged victorious and could construct narratives about heroic resistance and justified sacrifice, but even British veterans struggled with trauma that the victory narrative couldn't accommodate. The myth of the stoic British character, who'd endured the Blitz with good humor, couldn't make space for soldiers who broke down, for civilians who were traumatized by bombing, or for the moral injury of strategic bombing campaigns that killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. France faced the additional complexity of collaboration and resistance. The Vichy government had collaborated with Germany. French police had rounded up Jews for deportation, but the Free French and internal resistance had fought bravely. The psychological challenge was determining who had been heroes and who had been collaborators, and this determination affected whether individuals could speak about their wartime experiences or had to maintain silence about shameful actions. The purge of collaborators, tens of thousands executed or imprisoned, created trauma for their families who had to live with the stigma. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people in the war, more than any other nation, and Soviet citizens had endured the siege of Leningrad, the Battle of Stalingrad, and 4 years of brutal combat that destroyed cities and villages across the Western Soviet Union. But the Soviet government under Stalin didn't allow public mourning or processing of trauma because doing so might acknowledge that Soviet policies had contributed to the catastrophe, particularly Stalin's purges of military leadership before the war and his refusal to prepare for German attack despite clear warnings. Soviet soldiers returning from the war faced suspicion rather than celebration because Stalin feared they'd been contaminated by exposure to the West and might challenge communist authority. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet POWs were sent to gulags rather than allowed to return home because Stalin considered surrender to be treason. This denial of trauma and suppression of memory created patterns of intergenerational silence, where families couldn't discuss what they'd endured, where alcoholism and domestic violence transmitted trauma through generations, and where official Soviet narratives about the Great Patriotic War emphasized heroism while erasing suffering. Japan faced unique challenges because, unlike Germany, which eventually developed a culture of confronting its past, Japan struggled more with acknowledging Japanese atrocities and with integrating the atomic bombings into national narrative. The Japanese had suffered tremendously. The conventional firebombing campaigns killed more Japanese civilians than the atomic bombs, and millions of soldiers died in brutal combat across the Pacific. But they had also committed atrocities, including the rape of Nanking, forced labor and sexual slavery of occupied populations, and brutal treatment of POWs. The psychological challenge was similar to Germany's: how to acknowledge legitimate suffering while not minimizing Japanese responsibility for aggression and war crimes. The cultural response was often to focus on Japanese victimhood, particularly the atomic bombings, while minimizing discussion of Japanese aggression. This selective memory created its own intergenerational patterns, where younger generations knew little about Japanese wartime actions and couldn't understand why neighboring countries remained angry about events that seemed like ancient history. The hibakusha became uncomfortable symbols. Their suffering was real and deserved acknowledgement, but highlighting it risked appearing to claim Japanese victimhood that erased Japanese responsibility. The long-term legacy of 1945's trauma shaped the entire post-war world in ways we're still living with. The United Nations was founded on the promise, never again, but genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, and Darfur demonstrated that the lesson wasn't learned, and that the international community struggles to intervene effectively when atrocities occur. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights established that some values transcend national sovereignty, but enforcement remains weak and selective. The nuclear non-proliferation regime has prevented unlimited weapons spread, but 9 nations now have nuclear weapons, and the risk of nuclear war remains real. The Geneva Conventions updated protections for civilians and POWs, but modern warfare often deliberately targets civilians, and non-state actors don't follow international law. The creation of Israel as a homeland for Holocaust survivors created a new conflict that continues to traumatize new generations of Israelis and Palestinians. The Cold War that emerged from the post-war division of Europe created new traumas through proxy wars, nuclear brinkmanship, and the surveillance state. But 1945's legacy also includes positive developments that emerged from confronting what humans are capable of and determining to do better. The field of trauma psychology developed because of research on Holocaust survivors and combat veterans, creating treatment approaches that help millions of people with PTSD and complex trauma from various sources. The recognition that trauma transmits intergenerationally has created therapeutic approaches, specifically addressing inherited pain, breaking cycles that otherwise perpetuate across generations. The human rights movement, while imperfect, has established norms that make certain behaviors internationally condemned, even when they still occur. Holocaust education, while sometimes simplistic, has created awareness that genocide is possible and that preventing it requires vigilance. The economic integration of Europe through institutions that became the European Union was explicitly designed to make war between European nations economically suicidal, and it has succeeded in creating the longest period of peace in European history. Germany's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, working through the past while painful and incomplete, created a model for how societies can confront historical crimes rather than suppressing them. The contemporary relevance of 1945's trauma extends to current conflicts and to the ongoing work of healing inherited wounds. Veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan face challenges similar to 1945 veterans: difficulty reintegrating into civilian life, inability to explain their experiences to people who haven't been to war, moral injury from witnessing or participating in violence that violated their values, and a culture that often celebrates their service while being unwilling to fund adequate mental health care. Refugees from Syria, Myanmar, and other conflicts carry trauma similar to Holocaust survivors: displacement, loss of family and community, exposure to atrocities, and challenges of rebuilding lives in new countries that don't always welcome them. The descendants of slavery, colonialism, and other historical atrocities show patterns of intergenerational trauma similar to Holocaust and war trauma, demonstrating that the mechanisms of transmission aren't unique to 1945, but reflect universal human responses to severe and prolonged suffering. The therapeutic approaches developed for treating 1945 trauma have evolved to become more sophisticated and effective. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing helps process traumatic memories by allowing the brain to reintegrate them in ways that reduce their emotional charge. Somatic experiencing addresses how trauma is stored in the body, not just the mind, using body-based techniques to release stored tension and complete defensive responses that trauma interrupted. Narrative therapy helps people construct coherent stories about their experiences, integrating trauma into life narratives rather than having it remain fragmented and intrusive. Family systems therapy addresses intergenerational transmission by examining how trauma affects family dynamics and by working with entire families rather than just individuals. These approaches don't erase trauma. They can't bring back the dead or undo what happened, but they can help people live with trauma in ways that don't destroy their capacity for connection, meaning, and joy. The ultimate question 1945 poses for us today is whether we can learn from history without being paralyzed by it, whether we can remember what humans are capable of without losing faith in human potential for good. The answer seems to be that we must hold both truths simultaneously, that humans built Auschwitz and that humans risked their lives to hide Jews, that we created nuclear weapons and that we've mostly chosen not to use them since 1945, that we're capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary compassion. This complexity is uncomfortable because it offers no simple lessons. no reassuring narratives about progress or inherent goodness. But perhaps that discomfort is precisely what we need. The discomfort that prevents complacency, that keeps us vigilant against the conditions that enable atrocity, that reminds us that civilization is an achievement that each generation must choose to maintain rather than an inheritance we can take for granted. 1945 taught us that the worst is always possible, but it also taught us that resistance is possible, that courage exists even in extremity, that humans can endure unimaginable suffering and still choose life, choose hope, choose to build rather than destroy. That knowledge is both the burden and the gift that 1945 left us, and what we do with it will determine whether its trauma continues to echo through future generations or whether we finally learn to process it in ways that break the cycle and create something new.